Dajahao, my friends, and welcome to the 8 Princes DLC for Total War 3 Kingdoms. We're going to be taking a look at all the new units and the 8 Princes themselves, so that you can hopefully have a little bit of a better understanding when you come into the 8 Princes DLC yourself. This is going to be all about the units and how they perform on the battlefield, nothing really to do with campaign, so if you're looking for that, you may need to look elsewhere. I should also mention that all the units in this video are exclusive to one prince or another. They each have 1 or 2 unique units. No prince has them all. Anyway, let's get into these princes and see what they're all about. So to our first prince, Re. He is the only sentinel hero of the bunch. Sentinels, of course, a bit better at holding and surviving, keeping things fighting. And while he does have quite low morale and not a lot of armor piercing damage, he is the only prince with some melee evasion. So that's kind of something in itself. Most of his damage is non-armor piercing, so going to be better at taking down lightly armored troops. So be sure to choose his targets wisely. Some of his abilities include being unbreakable, so he won't rout. He can increase his melee evasion to help him stay alive, of course. And he has an AoE attack for damaging a group of enemies. On to our first champion in E. He's got a lot of morale, a lot of health, decent armor, but most of these princes do have decent armor actually, so you'll probably notice that. He does have a lot of armor piercing damage, not really a lot of normal damage, but that's fine. So good for taking on those heroes, of course. Some of his abilities include hamstring to reduce the enemy speed and increase their cooldown time. Another ability will reduce the cooldowns of your units, and one that increases charge resistance, melee evasion, and makes units unbreakable for a short time. So some good support abilities. And to our other champion, Sima Liang. Stat-wise, he's very similar to the other champion to be honest, although he does have some ranged block chance, which the other one didn't. But it's the abilities where these two champions differ. Where Sima had a lot of support abilities, Sima Liang is more offensive. He has a single target splash attack, can increase his ranged block chance, and best of all, his tenacity of steel ability will increase the damage he does the longer he's fighting. So his damage will increase in phases, making him pretty formidable as a duel wears on. Onto our vanguards, beginning with Sima. Another prince a little bit low on the morale, but he's making up for it with a mighty charge bonus, decent armor piercing damage, and some non-armor piercing damage as well. So he's got lots of damage to put around. Some of his abilities include scare, so he's going to reduce the morale of nearby enemies, a couple of splash attacks, and the ability to remove forest penalties and increase speed for himself and nearby units. And our other vanguard, Sima, very similar to the previous hero in stats, but he does have a fair amount more armor, making him that little bit tougher, and his abilities allow him to be an even better damage dealer, with the tenacity of steel again, so that phase-based ability that increases damage over time, the raw ability that will reduce enemy morale, and like many of these princes, he causes mighty knockback, which is one of those abilities along with scare and unbreakable that a lot of these princes have. I'm just not mentioning all of their abilities because I'll be here forever. And then we have our one and only strategist, Sima. He of course doesn't really want to tangle with anyone in melee because he doesn't have the stats for it and especially the morale for it, but his abilities is where he shines of course. Beginning with guerrilla deployment, meaning he can deploy outside of the deployment zone and set up some sneaky ambushes with his retinue of course, so you could get a couple of spears and a bunch of missiles and just have an absolutely brutal ranged flanking attack. He can also debuff the enemy's defenses by reducing their melee evasion and armor, which is pretty powerful, and can increase nearby units' ranged block chance. And lastly to our commanders, starting with Sima. He's got good leadership, which of course a commander should have, a great amount of armor piercing damage and some non-armor piercing damage, so plenty of that to go around. He also seems to be a fair bit faster than the other princes as well, with 79 speed, and abilities wise he has raw to reduce that morale, a passive charge resistance, which means it's going on all the time, so that's going to be very powerful for himself and nearby units, and also the ability to increase ranged block chance. And our last prince, Sima Luen. Now compared to the other commander, Sima, he's actually quite different. He has a fair amount less armor, only a little bit more than the strategist, and he doesn't do as much damage as Sima, the other commander, as he has less weapon strength overall. But of course, he's making up for this with his abilities. One of his coolest ones, Surprise Attack. It will give a unit stalk, so that'll make them invisible. It will make them cause fear, increase their damage and their speed. So you can turn pretty much any unit into a bunch of ninjas. try dropping this on a bunch of heavy cataphracts, one of the new cavalries, and enjoy. He can also increase melee evasion and reduce cooldown time. Now for the melee infantry, beginning with Sure Raiders. These are a light axe infantry, so good on the front line, good armor piercing damage. They've got a shield so they can protect against missiles, and they can potentially use different formations. So a nice inexpensive armor piercing frontline unit. They can do some damage when they get there, and they can avoid a bit of damage on the way up from those missiles using their shield. And then we have Warriors of Sure. Basically the same as the previous unit, with just a bit more armor on and better missile block chance with their improved shield. Most notably, they have a lot more melee evasion than the previous unit, so they're going to fill the same role, but they're going to be better at holding and staying alive. So you'll probably want to upgrade to these when you can and if you can afford them, but the other version will still provide that cheap armor piercing option. And then we have Dao Sword Guards, a medium sword infantry. Very similar to the previous unit to be honest, but they're not quite as tough stats wise, and their damage is the other way around. They don't have a lot of armor piercing, but they have a fair amount of normal damage, so they're going to be better at getting after those lighter targets. Use the different Sure Boys if you want some armor piercing. And now to the Chur infantry. These are heavy sword boys with a lot of armor, mostly non-armor piercing damage though, so look for those lighter targets. Got a decent amount of morale, but they have no shield, so missiles can be a problem for them. Best to not put them on the front line for that reason, otherwise they may get absolutely hammered. A nice support unit for bolstering your front line potentially. And our last melee infantry, the Imperial Guards. These boys are the ones you want on your front line if you've got money coming out the wazoo. They've got a lot of armor, a lot of morale, a lot of defense from missiles, a lot of melee evasion, a lot of holding power. So going to be a great choice if you're looking for that hammer and anvil, maybe with some cataphracts, but be aware that their damage is mostly non-armor piercing, so going to struggle against that heavy armor to really get any damage done. Only a couple of spear units, beginning with Chur Spearmen. They have a whole lot of armor as you can see, mostly armor piercing damage, which is quite a fair amount, and of course they're mainly designed as an anti-cav unit, with that charge reflection. So great at protecting your flanks from that enemy cavalry, but they don't have a shield, so they are very susceptible to being blasted by missiles. Armor piercing missiles such as crossbows will put them in the bin if you're not careful. And then we have Chi Guardsmen. They again have a lot of armor, but their damage is fairly evenly spread between base and armor piercing damage. So they can do pretty good all round damage, and they have significantly higher melee evasion than the previous unit, so they're going to be much better at surviving overall, or maybe surviving in a frontline situation. Although again, a lack of a shield makes them very vulnerable to missiles. Another great defender of your flanks, but they are a little bit more of an all-rounder as their role suggests. And to our couple of missile infantries, starting with the Archers of Jing. These are very much your typical archer unit, but they do have a good bit of armor on, so they'll be able to trade with other missile units that are perhaps less armored, and their melee evasion is pretty good as well, with some melee damage, so they can throw down a melee if they need to, basically, which makes them a little bit more independent. They still need to watch out for the cavalry, of course, but they can take on some lesser melee infantries and probably beat them if they could perhaps wear them down a bit with missiles first. Who knows? And then we've got Chi Crossbowmen. These are your typical crossbow unit, lots of armor piercing damage, good range, but they've got a whole lot of armor on, as you can see. So going to make them great at taking on other missile units, as they probably won't have as much armor as they do, and they'll be able to win that battle because of their armor piercing damage and their heavy armor. But they'll probably destroy anyone they decide to shoot at anyway. So for our first cavalry, well, they're the only melee cavalry, Dao Sword Guard Cavalry. They've got some armor on and a really decent shield that has a good ranged block chance. Got some melee skills as well, of course, mostly non-armor piercing damage though, so look for the lighter targets. They can stay in melee a little bit and tangle with enemies, rather than cycle charging like shock cavalries. So specifically, as usual, good for getting after those missiles, but they could get any light infantry really. Onto our shock cavalry with the Xianbei Riders. These are a halberd infantry, so a nice mix of both armor piercing and non-armor piercing damage. Decent armor, a decent charge, quite a lot of melee evasion for a shock cavalry, so they can hang around for a little bit. They actually have more melee evasion than that melee cavalry we just looked at, so that's going to say a lot. They can pose as a shock cavalry or kind of as a melee cavalry too. But one of their biggest selling points is their guerrilla deployment. So you can deploy them outside the deployment zone and try and set up some sneaky ambushes. As they can look after themselves pretty well, they could be fantastic for this. Although they have no shield, so they do need to watch out for missiles. And then we have the Xiongnu Cavalry. Definitely pronouncing a lot of these names wrong, by the way. But oh well. These fellas have good armor, a good shield that's going to protect them from missiles a little bit, lacking in the melee evasion of course because they are a shock cavalry, so they are designed to be cycle charged a bit more, these ones, especially as their damage is mostly armor piercing, so going to be great for cycle charging those heavily armored units and wearing them down. Just make sure you don't leave them in melee combat too long or they may suffer. And then we've got the Xiongnu Cataphracts. Very similar to the previous unit, to be honest, they just hit a little bit harder and are much tougher with all that extra armor. A little bit more melee evasion, but still not enough to warrant you leaving them in combat too long. Got the armor piercing damage, got a big old charge bonus because they're a shock cavalry, so very dangerous if you can cycle charge them effectively. And then we've just got some regular old Cataphracts who are kinda similar. Lots of armor piercing damage, little in the way of melee evasion, but these ones have no shield, so armor piercing missiles could be a big problem for them. So try to avoid those crossbows, cycle charge the crap out of everyone, and they will still destroy many men. But if you're in the market for the big guns, you're going to want to get some heavy Cataphracts. These, again, very much similar, shock cavalry, blah blah blah, armor piercing damage. Their differences being that they have even more armor than all the previous units, and they have the biggest charge bonus, so they hit harder than everyone else. They also have a bit of a ranged block chance, so missiles are a little bit less of a danger to them, but still pretty dangerous as they have no shield. If you can get these boys into the back of the enemy front line, it's game over for them. And lastly, to some missile cavalries, beginning with the Xianbei Horse Archers. These are a typical horse archer unit, to be honest, similar damage, similar range, similar armor, all that stuff, but they do have flaming shot, guerrilla deployment, and are resistant to fatigue, so they will not get tired, making them probably pretty much uncatchable by any other unit in the game, except maybe some heroes. So even better harassing potential for this missile unit. And then we have heavy mounted archers, who are pretty self-explanatory. They're just regular old mounted archers with a lot of armor on. So they can stand up to missiles a little bit, or at least take a few missiles a little bit, but still mostly good for just harassing and whittling down the enemy, although they are a little bit slower because of that extra weight of armor. And last but by no means least, the mounted crossbows. That's right, mounted crossbows. More range than the archers, more armor piercing damage of course, a good amount of armor, mostly still your typical skirmisher unit, they just have a bit more range in the armor piercing damage. So a nice addition, something that could be a bit more useful against the heavier stuff. Going to kite those heavy cavalries pretty well if they try to chase them. A potential remedy for all these heavy cataphracts that are going to be running around now. So there you go. All the new units in the 8 Princes DLC for Total War 3 Kingdoms. Hopefully now you know a little bit more what you're getting for your money. Of course, all the princes come with their own campaigns, and some of these units will be available to different princes like I mentioned. But hopefully this video gives you a little bit of a better understanding of all the new units and what they're capable of, so you can use them more effectively in battle. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future, my friends.